بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن وذكر الحكيم اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا بما ينفعنا وزدنا علم يقربنا منك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا واصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك اللهم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين آمين. Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and assalamu alaikum to the brothers and sisters on the Zoom call as well. Inshallah, I'm sure if you couldn't hear me, you would have probably said so by now. So inshallah, we're going to quickly finish off some of the slides from last time lesson that we didn't get a chance, but I'm going to whiz through them quite quickly. And then inshallah, go straight into the slides from today's lesson. As I mentioned on the message on the, that we sent out earlier, we'll have a break at 8:25, inshallah. The Isha prayer will be at 8:30. And then we will resume the class at around 8:50 or maybe 8:55, depending on how long the Salah took a bit longer last time. So as soon as the Salah is finished, we'll restart so either 8:50 or 8:55 to be safe, inshallah. And then we'll aim to finish today by 9:40 at the latest. Some of the students pointed out last time that a lot of time was spent in question and answer. So maybe that was also partly why we didn't get through all the slides. So we may have to limit the question and answers a little bit, but I do want to take question and answers and people to ask questions. So as last time, just put your hands up if you do have a question, and we'll try to leave time at the end of each section for some questions, inshallah. Okay, so let me share my slides, inshallah. So hopefully you can see it all okay on the slideshow. We were talking last time about ancient Arabia and ancient Arabian people. So we talked a bit about this stuff. We talked about how before the Arabs came with the Islam, there were throughout the millenniums preceding that, there were different waves of people that came out of Arabia. So the Arabs were the final of these waves. The Arabic language, now I'm not going to go into today, inshallah, but if people want to read more, they can read that paper I shared by Dr. Omar Abdullah. But basically, he was arguing that normally languages are, so a lot of languages are accrued over many centuries. But he was arguing that the Arabic language, as some of our scholars believe, that the Arabic language was not of that nature. It was actually a revealed language. But I don't want to go into that today. If you look at the Penguin History of Europe, one of the texts that we don't recommend, but is part of the reading. So I've taken some sections of it for reading, but it's a very, it's one of the best-selling histories of Europe. If you Google history of Europe, you know, textbook or a book, and this is actually one of the first ones that will come up. So it's one of the most popular books for people wanting to read like a little history of Europe, the Penguin History of Europe by Roberts. And it's a very clearly Eurocentric work. You can see this Western triumphalism pervading throughout the book. It's a bit outdated now. I mean, that's actually become quite unfashionable. But it's interesting that this is still like the top selling, well, at least the top of the Google search for one of these books. And this type of Western triumphalism or this Western superiority complex goes back to the 19th century, where, as we mentioned last time, the European powers, especially France, Britain, and Russia, between them had colonized most of the world, or if not colonized directly, had subjugated most of the world. And so they had become the world rulers, and they were developing this idea that the West was superior, that Europeans were superior to all other people. And this was all linked into evolution theory as well. When Darwin's theory came in, it got incorporated into that idea. And the way that they were describing history was that all of human history had been a gradual progress over many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, until you reached modern European civilization. And the modern white man was a rational white man, was a scientific white man, was the peak of all evolution. And this is where all civilization was heading. And all others that were not part of this category were inferior and would need to catch up to white Western civilization. This eventually led in the 20th century to the eugenics movements, the superiority of the Aryan race, and the Nazi movement with Adolf Hitler. A lot of people try to sort of bury this under the sand now, but Adolf Hitler, is my Zoom still working? Because it said signed out for some reason. Okay. So Adolf Hitler was not an anomaly. He was not someone strange who had these beliefs about white superiority. This was actually the mainstream belief across the whole of Europe, including Britain, France, and all the countries of Europe and America, that they believed in this idea of the white man being superior to all others. So racism was completely normal within the European society. We know Winston Churchill, for example, who fought against Hitler himself, was a very racist person. So that was the norm. And it was only after the Second World War that racism became taboo in the Western civilization. Because in the Second World War, millions of Jews were killed by Hitler. So the racism turned against the Jews. Before that, the Jews had lived amongst white European civilization and were assimilated within. So the racism didn't extend to them. But during the Second World War, Adolf Hitler turned the racism against the Jews themselves that were incorporated within the white European society. So this led to a massive a war between these factions in Europe, those that were against the Jewish people within Europe and those that were supporting the Jewish people in Europe. So after the Second World War, the Europeans realized that this racism was quite dangerous, because the same way it was applied to foreigners, it could also turn against people within Europe that were not, white Aryans, as the Jews were not. So after the Second World War, racism gradually became wiped out of European civilization. But until that time, it was very, very normal across the board in Europe. We talked last time about how these European colonialists were also trying to prove that they had this ancient pedigree, that they came from the ancient Greeks that were rational, philosophical, and somehow, the white Europeans were inheritors of this sort of scientific rational tradition. The truth is that they did not inherit from the Greeks. They inherited from the Muslims. The Muslims are the ones who had the Greek philosophy, and the Europeans only got that philosophy through the Muslims, through Arabic, and then translated back into Latin and other languages of Europe. So they had no direct connection to the ancient Greeks. And the other big thing that the Europeans claimed is that they have democracy, which came from ancient Greece. This is their theory. You must have heard that before, you know. Now, what I'm going to argue in this course is that that is also a myth. The democracy that came about in Western Europe, primarily in Britain, and then it was copied by many other, spread to other countries, had absolutely no connection to the ancient Greek philosophy that talked about democracy. Because if you think about it, where do Europeans trace back their democratic origins? They talk about things like the Magna Carta, you've probably heard of. The Magna Carta was a document that was signed in England between the barons and the king to limit the powers of the monarchy. And many people trace that as one of the early beginnings of democracy in Europe. Now, the Magna Carta had absolutely nothing to do with the Greek philosophy or the Greek idea of democracy. They didn't even know what the Greek philosophy was at that time, those people that were talking about the Magna Carta. So I'm going to argue that the origins of European democracy do not go back to ancient Greeks, but actually go back to the Vikings. The Vikings had this concept of democracy, and that's how they used to run their own societies. Each free man has a vote. And we'll talk about that later when we come back to studying about the Vikings, inshallah. So that's quite a radical challenge to the mainstream beliefs about European democracy. And I don't want to start blowing my own trumpet, but I may be the first person to point this out, or this may be a unique new theory that I've come up with. I don't know, because I haven't checked if anyone else has been writing about this or made that connection. People have written a lot about the Vikings and they've talked about how their societies were organized, but whether they've made that connection about the Vikings and how democracy then developed in Europe, especially in Britain being the leader, I'm not sure if that's ever been pointed out. So a good research for people.
That's a good point.
If they're interested. Yes. Muhammad Matar, did you have a question?
No, sorry. I apologize.
Someone was asking a question.
Yeah, that was by accident. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. If anyone does have a question, please raise your hands and then we'll try to answer the question. So here in some of these slides, which I'm going to whiz over a little bit quickly, I've described how the ancient Greeks, you know, were not connected to modern Europeans. Yes.
Where do Vikings trace their democratic roots and origins?
A good question. Yes. So when we talk about the Vikings, we're going to that. We don't know. The Vikings came out of Scandinavia all of a sudden. So when they started coming into European countries, the way they were organizing their society was in a democratic fashion, basically. So, you know, where they got that from, we really don't know, because they don't have written records or like a written, you know, they didn't have like a written theory about it. It was just the way they organized themselves. Maybe a natural way they organized themselves or whatever. It's not really clear where they got it from. But we'll talk about it in more detail when we come back to the Vikings, inshallah. Yeah, it's very interesting. Anyway, so I'm not going to talk about this stuff, but just the point here, main point was, you know, about how the ancient Greeks conquered a huge empire. But basically, you can see the Greek Empire was not European, if you look at the map. You know, it's very much an Asian, North African empire, Middle Eastern empire. And the Greeks didn't go anywhere near what is modern Europe or modern Western civilization? The core countries that form modern Western civilization are Germany, France, and Britain. So just keep that in your mind. Germany, France, and Britain are the main countries that formed modern Western civilization. Obviously, from there they spread to North America, to Australia, and many other lands. But these are the core, these are where modern Western civilization comes from, these three core countries. And then later on, the Romans took over from the Greeks, and the Greeks were also, once again, very much a Mediterranean power. They did move into Western and Northern Europe, into France, Spain, and Britain, but they very much saw those people as barbarians. So this is the extent of the Roman Empire at its peak. So they did take Spain, France, and Britannia, and the Romans called the people of England Britons, which is where the term Britain comes from. They were called Britons. And Hadrian's Wall in northern England, border of northern England, Scotland, Hadrian's Wall was the limit of the Roman Empire in Europe, and it was referred to as a limit of civilization. Beyond that, the uncivilized barbarians ruled in Scotland. Britain was invaded for the resources. We talk about silver, copper, other minerals that the Romans wanted to get their hands on, lead. And that was the main role of Britain in the Roman Empire. It was very much a colonized land. The other thing we wanted to challenge is the evolution myth we already alluded to. As we go along in the course, and we talked a little bit about it last week, and we're going to talk about it later again, so I won't dwell on it too much. The difference between civilized and barbarian societies. And I remember I said that I like the term barbarian, although I'm sure a lot of people will object to me using that term. But just to keep the history course spiced up a bit, we'll keep using it, because it invokes all sort of things in your mind, right? Anyway, this was the sort of differences we could say between civilized and barbarian people. Civilized people live by law, they have government, they have reading and writing, etc., etc. They're normally settled people, they have towns, cities, and they have agriculture, farming, and things like that. Whereas the barbarians, historically, they have no government, they have no laws, they have tribal code, which we'll come to later, because they live in tribal society. They cannot read or write normally. Remember the Arabs, only very few Arabs could read or write at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There are unlettered people, and Nabi al-Ummi, the unlettered prophet. And normally these barbarian people are either nomadic or semi-nomadic. They move around with their animals. They don't have, they're not farmers. They don't have that technology for agriculture and things like that. So they're very simple lives. You know, imagine you live a life where you can just pack up your whole house and move to a different place. You know, literally within a couple of tents, you put it on the back of 2 camels and you move. How many of us could live like that? You know, people who have tried to move house, you'll understand what I'm talking about. I moved house last year. It's a nightmare, you know, for people like us. Moving out, people think, oh, I'll never want to do that again, right? Because it's just absolutely unbelievable how much stuff you have, you know. But these people, they're completely on the road all the time, you know. So they're literally able to pack up their stuff within one afternoon. They'll pack everything on the back of their animals and they'll move on. So they live very, very simple life. Now their lives are normally just a life of survival, because they live in those harsh environments, deserts, the Eurasian steppes, and these type of places. Sometimes maybe mountains. Many mountainous people are semi-nomadic. So they move in the mountains in the summer, and they move down in the winter to the low levels. So that's what we mean by semi-nomadic. You know, they move. These people often, they don't have that higher culture of reading, writing, art, architecture. Their religion is often very primitive religion, what you call primitive religion, so shamanistic.
Does the barbarian also refer to the nomadic Turks?
Yes, before they get religion, before they get the Islamic religion.
And the culture as well?
Yeah. Yeah, their culture is these are very much those type of Turkic tribes that came from the Eurasian steppes, very much follow this pattern. So you see the religion they have is also, it's what we would call a primitive religion. It's based on shamans, which are like basically possessed holy people. Like they call them holy people, but they communicate with spirits and they get possessed by spirits. and they believe in that sort of healing and everything. Now, the important thing about these people are they're very tough. Like we said last time, you could describe them as super warriors. Because they live in these very harsh climates, their bodies are conditioned from a young age, and they live on the edge of survival. So so this is why the Romans, the Chinese, and then later on the Muslim empires had massive problems trying to deal with these people, because they're normally around the borders and they're normally trying to invade the empires. So normally different empires have worked out different strategies on how to deal with these people. Often they will pay them off, just literally pay them off, give them a lot of money to go away. They may try to incorporate them into their army. So they actually take them on as warriors for their own armies, and so on and so forth. The Great Wall of China was built for that reason, to keep out these barbarians, from the Eurasian steppe lands.
It's interesting, Alexander, when he was in Afghanistan for 3 years, he was paying the tribal leaders to basically stay off his back.
We're going to come back to the Pashtuns, inshallah, because they are actually the last probably tribal people left today. The true tribal people left, and throughout history, not just Alexander the Great, but everyone's always been paying them off, to just stay in the mountains and don't trouble us, including the British who are paying them off for everyone. Anyway, so the evolution myth is this idea that, through thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, human beings have slowly been evolving through all these stages until eventually they got to modern industrial Western civilization, the grand peak, the grand finale, the great achievement of human beings. So this is not a simple thing. This is a very deeply rooted within us, because we've been grown up on this type of thing. We don't question it much. And partly why I was showing last time about prehistory, that prehistory is literally maybe 200,000 years, that we don't know what happened with human beings during that time. So a lot of it is very much assumption. So you might be familiar with this type of idea. Human beings lived as hunter-gatherers for thousands, maybe millions of years. Then they started farming, the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago. And then eventually, after 10,000 years, there was suddenly an industrial revolution led by Britain and the West. And then human beings came into the modern age with modern industrial societies. I'm saying to you, question this. You don't know whether there was advanced technology and civilization in the past. We just don't know, because it's prehistory. There's no records of those times. So similarly, they have this parallel sort of thing, Aboriginal people are very primitive. And then you have sort of agrarian, farming, peasants, those type of people. And then finally you have the modern industrial, technological people who are the most advanced. This is another. So you see, all these are linked up. They're all to do with evolution, Stone Age, then you have Bronze Age, then you have the Iron Age, right? Everything is advancing over thousands and millions of years. Similarly here, even with religion, so sociologists have said religions evolve over thousands of years. We talked about the most primitive shamanistic religion. Then it goes to polytheistic, where idol worshippers. Then you advance to monotheistic, where people worship one God. And then you move on to the Enlightenment, where you have a sort of a rational metaphysics. And finally, you move into the modern Western model, which is called positivism, which is when you leave God behind and you simply believe in science and empirical, what they call empirical knowledge. This was literally how the picture has been painted and is still taught in many schools today. That everything is an evolution. And then, so that's a religious evolution. And then you have a political type of evolution as well. So the very primitive people are tribal people. Then you get feudalism. Then you get the absolute monarchies. And finally, you get the transition to democracy, which is the most modern and advanced way of government. So as you can see, this sort of idea of evolution is what I'm trying to point out, extends to all these different realms, political, religious, and so on, economic and so on. And that's the economic one, right? So this is a very, very powerful idea that everything, economics, politics, social organization, religion even, is all evolving until we get to modern white man. Yeah, and this is not just me being funny or racist. This is literally how this was all presented until the Second World War. And I'm sure you've seen this diagram probably still in your biology books, yeah? Notice how the person gets fairer as well, more whiter as he evolves from the black chimp to the white man, you know? Literally the color of the skin changes as well. Okay, I'm going to skip this slightly because we'll be coming back to some of this idea about the sort of the nomadic and semi-nomadic people. But this was the idea, you know, there's a difference between those nomadic people that go around with their animals, yeah, and then there's people that farm. So farming communities, this is where you start getting more advanced civilization. When you have farming, you have people settled in one place, you have villages, then you slowly get the buildup of towns and cities as well. Because the farming produce, the farmers produce more than they need for themselves. So the excess can be used to pay the people in the towns and the cities, who then become specialized in other things like building, architecture, arts, crafts, and so on. So that's what we call an agrarian economy, agriculture or a farming-based economy. The wealth is produced by the farmers. That's ultimately where the wealth comes from, is from the farming. But they produce more than they need for themselves, and then that supports the town or the city. Is there a question at the back? No? Suhail? You have your hand up, did you, Suhail? No, okay. So question this whole idea of evolution. We don't know what was happening more than 10,000 years ago. Human beings might have started 200,000 years ago, maybe 2 million years ago, depending on whether we take it as Homo sapiens or humanoid species. So beyond 10,000 years, we have no records. We have very, very little just archaeological evidence. So maybe there was advanced technologies in the past. We simply don't know. And also, if it was an evolution, why are those different types still coexisting? Why are there still nomadic people? Why are there still agrarian-based economy and so on? Okay, so that was the end of that one. Now we're going to rapidly go into today's slides, inshallah. Stop here. Any quick questions on those before we start today's slides?
Just one.
Yeah, go
on. You mentioned at the end, in terms of the evolution, that democracy is at the end.
Yes.
So if they're teaching that, how do they explain the Greek? Because they always refer back to the Greek democracy that.
Exactly, another good point. Yeah. So if it was an evolution, why did it go and then come back again? You know what I mean? That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
You know, where you said that evolution, the three types still continue to exist.
Yes.
Can you just clarify the three types?
I think I was referring to nomadic people and agrarian, or what was the other evolutionary? You know, so the different religious, polytheistic. If that was, then why are there still idol worshippers now? And you know, so they haven't evolved. They're still here now. So it doesn't sort of make sense if it's an evolution. But those who argued that it is an evolution, they'll probably say, well, they still haven't caught up with the rational white man. You know, this has gone a bit out of fashion now. And like I said, after the Second World War, this whole racism idea became a bit taboo. But it's still there, you know, it's still there, and it's quite hard to get. I mean, evolution is definitely still there very strongly within the general teaching.
So repeat the questions if they come from the back. It's difficult to have them.
Okay, so the question was what we meant about the three types still coexisting in the evolutionary picture. Okay, inshallah, so we'll go to the next slides.
Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, salam. Is that a question?
Yes, please. I've heard that Darwin got this idea of evolution from an Islamic scholar, Ibn Khaldun.
Yes.
Is there any truth in it?
Yeah, good question. The question was that some people say the evolution idea Darwin may have got from Ibn Khaldun. I don't know any evidence for that. I think, I mean, a lot of stuff that the Western thinkers got was from Muslims, and a lot of it is becoming uncovered in recent years. Because what happened was during the 18th and 19th century, when Europeans were making all these advances, they were not attributing it back to the Muslim sources that they were getting it from a lot of the time. So inshallah, in one of our later classes, we do go into a lot more about that as well. But for now, I'd say specifically with the evolution, Darwin's evolution theory, I don't know if there's any direct correlation. I know Ibn Khaldun does probably have some ideas of that nature. And other people have also pointed out that Jalaluddin Rumi, in one of his, some of his writings in the Masnawi, he also alludes to what could be a type of evolution. So the Muslims may have, some Muslim scholars may have come up with something of that nature. For right now, I don't want to go into a tangent on the evolution idea, but I would just will summarize my view on evolution by saying that I don't believe in the biological evolution as Darwin described it, but I don't believe that there's anything in Islam contradicting it, if you see what I mean. So I don't think Islam says that that cannot be true. If Allah had chosen to create the human being or life through an evolutionary process, that is rationally possible in my mind. However, I don't believe the scientific evidence supports evolution theory, but that's a whole nother talk, inshallah, which we can do at another time. I don't think it's that important for us right now. I don't think it's a make or break, like we have to believe in evolution or we don't believe in evolution or anything like that. So today we're going to talk a bit about bias in history. We're going to talk about renaming and reclaiming our history. And we're going to then end with an overview of the whole period that we're going to study in the coming classes, inshallah. So talk about bias. Whenever we read history, always be aware of bias. Think about the historian, what worldview they hold. Are they really objective? Western scholars claim to be objective, and they think that's what they are. But modern or more recent anthropology has now focused on Western scholarship itself, and they've come to realize that there's no such thing as true objectivity. Everyone has some sort of bias. I don't know why the screen is doing that. Let me just try to shut down. Just bear with me for a second.
Maybe just shut down the previous.
Yeah. Shut down the previous. You cannot minimize Zoom. Okay. Let's have a look at the slides. Close that one. Only this one's open now. Hopefully that may help. Sorry, we're just having a problem with the main screen. Now I'm going to try again, inshallah.
Yes, right.
Yeah, okay, good. So yeah, examine the historian. No one's really objective, no matter how much they claim in Western university that they're objective. Now, this is recognized by modern anthropology, that Western historians and just Western scholars in general have their own biases, have their own worldviews. And no one can totally escape from their own worldview and become totally objective. Now, there's a difference in how Muslims traditionally used to write history. Our Muslim classical scholars, Muslim historians in the past had a certain methodology for writing history, which is quite different to modern Western style of history writing. If you look at, and the Muslims wrote a lot of history. The Muslims probably, that was their biggest project, you know, writing history, what they call biographies, a seer. The biographies, I mean, the Muslim is huge volumes and volumes of work. Because the Quran tells us that history is a source of knowledge. You know, this is one of the things that the Quran points out. It talks about historical things, and it tells us that this is a source of learning. This is where we can learn things from history. So the Quran opened that door. You know, that history is very important for us to understand and learn and get wisdom. So that's why the Muslim scholars did really focus on historical writing, and most of their history writing was based around biographies. But the Muslim scholars had a methodology, and normally their methodology in writing history was to have collections of eyewitness reports. Yeah, they would collect eyewitness reports. These are what we call, even if you think about hadith are basically eyewitness reports from the Prophet ﷺ. You know, and so the eyewitness is a Sahabi. Yeah, and these eyewitness reports were recorded in meticulous detail by the historians with the isnad. The isnad is the chain that leads you back to the eyewitness. So let's say, for example, Mubin witnessed a car crash yesterday in Hounslow High Street, right? He saw a bus crashing into a car, and he came and told me about it. Then I went and I told the historian, oh yeah, Mubin told me that he saw this car crash, the bus crashed into a car, 10 people died. It was really bad. The historian would then write that down, that this is from Dr. Rizwan, from Mubin, who lives in Southall. Sorry to give away your address there. That Mubin saw a bus crash into a car on so-and-so time. So the isnad is from the historian to me to Mubin. Mubin is the eyewitness. He's the Sahabi. Yeah, inshallah, you have the Barakah Sahaba. And so that's how isnad works. It's not just for hadith. So the Muslim historians use isnad for every reporting and they did in their history books. Yeah, so one would say, for example, the most famous early work in Islamic history is a work by a historian called Tabari. Tabari is considered the real classic work in the field. So if you read Tabari, it's like 20 volumes, massive encyclopedia of all of world history up until his time. Yeah? All of world history up until his time, which was early Abbasid period. So everything he narrates in that book, it is always of this nature. It will be an eyewitness report with a isnad, a chain of narrator to him, all the way to him. So I heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, who saw the Khalif, Harun Rashid, had 2 daughters or so, whatever. So this was a very strong methodology, a very strong method and powerful methodology, because anyone who comes later, they can see exactly where that information has come from. From who, from who, from who, from who. You see what I mean? So, and it was a very objective way to record history, I would argue, much more objective than the later Western historical method that we're going to talk about in a minute. Because the Western historical writing is very much based on interpretation, the interpretation of the historian himself. Whereas the Muslim historians were not interpreting anything. They were literally verbatim recording what the eyewitness has said. They put no interpretation of their own on that account. Now, if the historian had some sort of view of his own, or an opinion of his own, or an interpretation of his own, he would mention that afterwards. So typically, someone like Tabari, for example, if he's, say, talking about Harun Rashid and his relationship with his wife, let's say, he will bring all the eyewitness accounts, like we said, and he will quote them verbatim. He will not add anything of his own. And then at the end of that chapter or section, he may then add a comment of his own. Like, for example, he might say, the eyewitness account of Mubin is more reliable than the eyewitness account of Haris, who claims that the bus did a somersault in the air and everyone died. Right? Because Haris, unfortunately, has a poor memory, whereas Mubin has a very strong memory. Yeah, so that type of thing, he may make a comment But before he makes that comment, he will very faithfully record all of the eyewitness accounts. Some of them may be contradicting each other, as is the nature. When you have a scene and you have different witnesses, they often do, you ask people afterwards, what did you see? They've done lots of studies on this in psychology now. You know, they've done, if you literally show, if I showed you guys something now on the screen, and literally 1 hour later, I said, give your account of what you saw, it would all of you would be different. Sometimes radically different. And that's literally within 1 hour of seeing something. So many studies have been done on this. So it's the nature of things that often you will get different accounts depending on people's recollection. Sometimes the people may have biases of their own because they support certain viewpoint or whatever. So the historian, the Muslim historians, they just recorded everything. And then they analyzed it. You know, okay, well, let's take into account this guy was a Mu'tazilite. He had some bias towards the Mu'tazilite, so maybe that's why he said this, and etc., etc. That was the Muslim methodology. And the great thing about that is that we today can go back to their books and we can see the sources that they had, and then we can see their analysis. And then we can even, you know, interpret in different ways now. So it was a very strong, powerful, and I would say a very scientific methodology. And the reason why I'm going on about this is because what Western scholars and historians sort of portray today is that Western historians are the height of objectivity. Western academia is the height of objectivity. And the Muslims, just like everyone else before, they were sort of a bit backward, and they were not very scientific, and they were basically just writing all sorts of rubbish and just really biased and all that sort of stuff. That is basically the type of portrayal you'll get if you study in Western university today. So once again, let's challenge that idea completely, because the Muslims, like, I'll give you an example. The Muslims have a very strong tradition of travel writing. Yeah. So Muslim travelers used to go around different countries, and they used to record in meticulous detail what they saw in all their travels. Ibn Battuta, I'm sure you've heard of, is a very famous example, but he's one of many that were writing about their travels. And what you find with the Muslim travel writers are they are recording things very accurately, very scientifically. They're not exaggerating, they're not into like, and if you compare that with a Western travel writer like, who's that famous one that went around China and all those places? Marco Polo, right? You've heard of Marco Polo. He's a sort of big famous one who lived in the Middle Ages. So roughly the same time as Ibn Battuta. If you read he traveled around to China. He was one of the very few Europeans at that time who actually traveled around the world. And he wrote about all of his travels. He traveled through Muslim lands and everywhere. If you read his travel writings, they're completely full of exaggeration, to the point he talks about massive dragons and monsters and big cyclops with big one eye and all this rubbish in there, right? So Western academics, they're very sort of, their arrogance, they say, oh yes, all people before us were basically exaggerating, you know, yes, there's some good in what they wrote and everything, but there's a lot of bias and exaggeration and all this stuff. So I have a very strong problem with that. Because if you study it carefully, the Muslims had a very scientific culture in their madrasas, in their colleges and universities. And if you read how Ibn Battuta and others have written their stuff, and then you compare that to historical evidence that we have, you'll always find it's 100% accurate. You will never find any contradictions in those accounts, and then the historical evidence that has been found later on. So that's really important, I think. Sometimes the Muslim historians will just give the eyewitness reports and not give any commentary of their own, not give any interpretation of their own, because they're just producing for you the facts of the eyewitness reports, and you can then come to your own conclusions about it. And as I said, if they do give an opinion, they will give it separate from the eyewitness accounts at the end of the section or the chapter. The downside of these Muslim historical writings, they can be very cumbersome to read. Because literally, even if you try reading something like Tabari or any of that Muslim histories, they're very, you're reading, oh, so-and-so related from so-and-so, related from so-and-so, related from so-and-so, that he saw that Harun Rashid had 2 wives. Then so-and-so related from so-and-so, related from so-and-so, that Harun Rashid had 3 wives, and so on and so forth. So reading through that just for one point, you're gonna be, you can get very, very bored. And so unless you're a real sort of academic, really want to read that, you can sometimes be a bit cumbersome. Now, the Western method is an interpretive method of writing history. So, if you get any normal history textbooks, history books that are recommended in this course, for example.
Someone said a question on the chat. Can the method of writing history with Islam still be used today, considering people don't meet the criteria of good narrators during the early centuries of Islam?
Yeah, good question. I think you probably, if you didn't hear the question, can the method of Isnad historical writing still be used today? I would say yes, it can, because the reason why you have to have very reliable narrators is only for hadith. It's only for hadith, remember, because hadith are going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, what he says is law, and what he says is haqq. So we have to have a very high standard when we look at the Isnad. But when you're dealing with historical reports, you don't have to have that very high standard. The standard is much, much lower. So if Haris told me that Mubin saw a car crash, that's fine. I believe that, I don't have a problem with that. I'm not going to start saying is Haris extremely reliable? Does he pray all his 5 daily prayers? Does he go for Hajj? And what they done for Hadith science is different, right? It's very, very different. So yes, you can definitely use that method today. It's a generally valid method for giving eyewitness reports. If you look at the sort of evidences that Western historians use, very, very, very weak compared to those eyewitness chains, Literally, they make whole massive interpretations from one little tiny fragment of a letter or something like that. So it's very important to understand how the history is written. So the historians, Western historians, they'll take the primary sources, so it might be an eyewitness account, it may be a fragment of a letter, it may be a writing, whatever it is. And then they will try to piece together a story around that. But when you do that, you will inevitably put in a lot of your own opinions. Why did Harun Rashid kill his closest vizier, the Barmakid's family? Why did he have them in prison and killed? Yeah, we don't know. All of a sudden, the people that were closest to him, he had their heads chopped off and had their bodies chopped into little pieces. Now, the Muslim historian will just give the eyewitness account. He will just say what happened. But the Western historian will sort of make a story around it. Probably Harun Rashid must have been feeling a bit paranoid. Maybe he thought they were plotting against him. That's why he had them killed. You see what I mean? So there's an interpretation, a story being created that is not 100% definite. So there's that aspect. So there's interpretation and assumptions being made in this type of history telling. And ultimately, we don't know for sure what the human motives may have been. Yeah, I'll give you another example. When Sayyidina Umar died, rahimahullah, he left 6 people he left a panel of 6 Sahaba, leading 6 Sahaba of his time. And he said, between you, you have to decide who's going to be the next Khalifa. And I'll give you 3 days to do that. Right? So the Western historian like Marshall Hodgson, this is one of the very, very few criticism I have of his book, which is a highly recommended book. He said that those 6 people then descended into a lot of rivalry and jealousy and struggling for power. But that's his interpretation. Our interpretation is that these were great Sahaba, and none of them even wanted to have that power. People like Sayyidina Ali, they would have run away from that type of power. See what I mean? So that's what I mean by, when you start trying to guess what the human motives are, you're going to interpret that according to your own understanding. And you cannot be sure what human motives have been for historical events unless that human being wrote down his motive and explained it. And even then you can't be sure because they could be lying. And then in the Western academic tradition, we have this phenomenon where it just drives you crazy. Every new generation of historians, not even generation, but every new cohort in the university, they have to somehow come up with a new revision of the previous historical understanding, because that's the only way to get forward in academia and do a PhD, is when you somehow overturn someone else's work and you're able to, and this just gets a bit absurd at times, gets a bit over the top, you know. Although there's obviously a lot of good in that, to be always challenging received knowledge is obviously a good thing, but it can get a bit over the top. Additionally, I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of the conquerors write the history. So the Western civilization since the 19th century certainly has been the world dominant civilization. And throughout the 19th century and then coming into the 20th century, they've been the ones who have dominated the world's academic circles, universities, academia generally. So they are very much telling the history. You know? So history is not neutral. History has a lot of consequences. And this is partly the intention behind this history course, why I've spent quite a few years, last 6 or 7 years developing this course and teaching it, is because history is very, very important. Like I alluded to before, history is one of the primary sources of knowledge. The Quran tells us this. Allama Muhammad Iqbal, one of our great scholars and philosophers from the Indian subcontinent, he said this in his, in his work, that there's 3 sources of knowledge that the Quran points to. And one of them is history. The Quran tells us to look at what happened to the civilizations before us. Right? So history is enormously important for us as a people, as a society as well. It has massive consequences. If we know our history, we know who we are, we're going to know where we came from, we're going to be someone. And what the West recognizes this very much, and they've tried to destroy our history and fragment our history. People. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله الحمد لله رب العالمين One of the things I love about teaching in the masjid, the barakah, and this is how Islam was first taught in the early generations in the masajid. Anyway, so have you ever met your Pakistani relative or your Indian relative and wondered why they know more about British history than you do? Why they talk about Magna Carta and all this stuff, and you're thinking, wow, yeah. That's because this was very intentionally done by the British and the French and other colonial powers, that, you know, the elite schools they were teaching them British history. Yeah. Divorcing the Muslims from their own history is very important. After the invasion of Iraq, just in 2001 or two or so, museums were burnt down. Yeah, museums where all of the history of Baghdad and Iraq is one of the most ancient civilizations. Before the Muslims, they had the Mesopotamian and the Babylonian and all of those. It's a cradle of civilizations. Now, museums were burnt down and people were thinking, what's going on? Now, this guy, Robert Fisk, was a Western journalist. He was one of the few European journalists that was brave enough to be inside Iraq during the war. Most of these journalists, they were hiding with the army and, behind CNN, hiding behind the American army. Robert Fisk was actually on the ground in Baghdad. May Allah guide him to, he's such a brave man, and he was writing about what was happening. And, he risked his life. He was beaten up several times by Muslims, sadly, who just saw him as a Westerner. They didn't know he's from England. He writes for the Independent and the Guardian and things like that. Independent, I believe. Anyway, he, on one occasion, he was following these guys that were coming into Baghdad. And he said it was very strange. These people were just driving from outside of Baghdad into the city, straight to one of these museums or libraries, going in there, setting a fire and driving straight out. It wasn't like random acts of violence or anything like that. He wrote this I've got the newspaper clipping, if anyone wants it. He actually wrote an article on that saying that this is not, because it was portrayed like this is just random, chaos, there's like anarchy, people are going around burning down buildings and all this stuff. We're losing all this historical culture. But he said, no, these people, they drove into the city, straight to that place, burn it down, and they drive straight out. This is a targeted thing. And he was one of the few people that witnessed that. So this is very important. They know, they want to destroy our history. They don't want the Iraqi people to know where they've come from. So there's a huge bias in many, many textbooks in the English language. Let's say, for example, how Aurengzeb is dealt with in Western history, in most history books. This is just one example of the sort of bias you'll find. Now, Aurengzeb is the greatest Mughal emperor by consensus. I mean, everyone agrees with that in terms of the vast land of India had never been so united. Aurengzeb had the biggest empire of India of all historical precedents. He was the first one to have the massive unification of India. He had the longest reign, one of the longest reign of all the Mughal emperors, and one of the most prosperous and peaceful. And from a Muslim point of view, he was very pious. He was very unlike the other Mughal emperors who were very much into, for example, worldly excess. They used to wear jewelry and have all of that, luxuries and things like that. He was very sort of pious. He didn't, you can see in the picture, he didn't wear all of the jewels that the Mughal emperors used to wear before him. He tried to live a very simplistic life, but he is completely criticized in the writing of Western historians and in the writing of the Indians. Now, don't forget, the Indians today have got a big grudge against the Muslims. So he gets a negative press from every side, right? Now, Ustad Jawad, inshallah, is going to come and give a talk about the Mughals as part of the history course later on. So we will go into this in much more detail. And one of the things that Ustad Jawad will point out to you is that Aurengzeb had more Hindus in his government than Akbar. But Akbar is the one that they all love, And Aurengzeb is, he's a fanatic Muslim. He was, why? Because he bought the jizya. He brought back the jizya, the tax for non-Muslims. But they neglect to mention that he actually had more Hindus at the highest levels of his government than Akbar did. Right? So there's a lot of things to question. But you will always see him depicted as an extremist, religious fanatic, bigoted, and so on. Mainly because he brought back the jizya, yeah, which is Islamic Sharia. So, you know, where are the Muslim historians to challenge these ideas now? You know, this is why we desperately need a new generation of Muslim historians to be bringing back our history. Now, one thing to mention is that civilization came to Western Europe very late on. Even if you do consider Greek and Roman to be part of the history of Western civilization, in the grand scheme of things, that is quite late on. You know, the Greek Empire came around about 1000 BC, and then later on we had so that's actually quite late on compared to other ancient civilizations. And then parts of Northern Europe, like we mentioned, the Germanic lands, Scandinavian lands, even the Romans didn't go into those regions, yeah. So they remained barbarian. So when the British Empire first started becoming the dominant world power in the 19th century, even in the 18th century, it had already begun. There was a rival with France. By the 19th century, when Napoleon had been defeated, Britain was the leading power in the world. But people used to make fun of the British. Like, where's their history? Who are these guys? Where have they come from? So Napoleon famously mocked the British for being a nation of shopkeepers. You know, he was trying to say, basically, these guys have got no civilization. They've got no culture. They're just traders, basically. You know, that's what he was trying to say. So this sort of explains why then they had to develop this sort of like historical thing, you know, trying to link themselves to the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and so on. Inshallah, let's take the break for Salah. And we will try to get back by 8:50 if the Salah is finished. If not, as soon as possible after 8:50, we will restart the class. So if people on the Zoom, if you can come back for 8:50, inshallah.
Would you recommend Lewis Mumford's book on techniques and human development?
Lewis Mumford's book? I haven't read it myself, to be honest. I've read Pentagon of Power, so generally I would recommend his books, but I haven't read that one.
And what does postmodernism say about evolution?
What does postmodernism say about evolution? I think you'll have to ask someone else. Who's more, so I mean, I don't get the question, because postmodernism is not a school of thought or a, you know, a certain point of view. So I think it's difficult to say, but I think I get the gist of what you're asking, and whether evolution is brought into question. I think postmodernism doesn't say anything apart from the fact that it's a sort of relativistic. So relativism, that, you know, you would question evolution just like we question everything. So nothing can be known for certain, that type of thing. So apart from that, I don't think it says much. And relativism refutes itself, because if you believe in relativism, that nothing can be ultimately proven to be true, then what you're saying cannot be proven to be true either. So you refuted yourself. So relativism carries within itself its own destruction. Anyway, so yeah, that was a good question, but hopefully that answered it. So where were we? The world map was turned upside down to place the north at the top of the world. The world map had always been with the south at the top, historically. When European civilization started to become dominant, they turned the map around. So the map that we're familiar with nowadays, the north is at the top. That is actually the opposite. You know, when we talk about Australia down under, oh, down under. Actually, we're down under, yeah? The north is down under. If you look at the Muslim maps and even European maps of that time, the south was at the top, the north was at the bottom. And that's how the map should be. It makes a very big psychological difference. So if you look at the British Empire, and then you look at the Britain on the map, you know, when you see Britain right at the top of the world, it makes a big psychological difference. Also, I think we mentioned it briefly, but we'll talk about it a bit more today. The world map is distorted to make the countries that are more north look bigger than they actually are. And we're going to show you how that works in a minute. Also, European civilization, it calls itself the West, but actually it's not the West, it's the North. If you look at the Western civilization, they are the countries of the North, especially if you consider Russia as part of Western civilization, which I do. Literally, Western civilization is the North of the world. So I think it should be called the North, but we're never going to change that, so there's no point trying. But so this is a world map. Now, if you think about the world is a globe. And when you have, I'm going to try to use the annotation thing here now. So let me see if I can find it again. I annotate, highlight, yeah. So you should see the red cursor now. And why is this have to be right? Let me see if I can move this out of the way slightly. Yeah, move that down there. So as you can see, on the globe, you have these lines going up and down, right? These are the lines of longitude. And then you have the lines that go across, which are the lines of latitude, right? Now, if you think about it, the world is a globe, so it's like an orange. So as the lines of longitude go up, they should become closer and closer together. And at the North Pole, they should actually join. Like if you think about the segments of an orange, right? It's exactly the same. The lines of longitude, they join at the North and they join at the South Pole. So these lines here I'm talking about, yeah, they should actually be getting closer and closer together. And at the North Pole, they should join. And at the South Pole, they should join. So when they draw the map like this, they've expanded. The more further north you go, the more expanded that has become. And the more further south you go, the more they've opened it up, like an orange, like it's literally opened up. So if you look down here at the South Pole, for example, the Antarctic, look how huge it is. That's not really huge like that. It's quite small. But because the more south and the more north you go, the more it's expanded. So the countries that are around the middle here, the equator, they look much smaller than they actually are in comparison to the countries that are far north and far south. So all of Western Europe and America, they're quite north, so they look much bigger than they are. Look how big Greenland is. Greenland is not that big, you know, Rula.
Is it not to do with the bias of the white man?
It is, yeah. I think it was done very deliberately because it has a big psychological effect.
It does, yes.
You know, look how Russia is not actually that big. China is much bigger than it looks here because China is more towards the equator. So when you get the true picture is when you look at actually the globe itself. This is even more distorted. Here you can see the lines are completely straight. Yeah, they don't even go even a little bit in. They should be converging, right? So this is the most distorted, this type of map, when the lines are completely straight, the lines of longitude. This is how it actually should be. Can you see here the lines of longitude? They get closer and closer together as you go more and more north, yeah? That's the true shape of the Earth. So you can see how, you know, these areas have become massively expanded in comparison to these areas. You see what I mean? See these squares, they get smaller and smaller. And that's how it should be. This is how it should be. Yeah, so you see here how the lines are so far apart, but here they're much closer together. So this is actually drawn to scale, and you can see here, look how huge Africa is compared to Europe. It's huge. So the whole of Western Europe here can fit inside Algeria in reality, yeah, which is here. This is basically Algeria, this small country here, right? And this is Western Europe here. They've attempted to make it more realistic. and bring it more closer as they go up and down. So this is a bit better, but not completely accurate. The only completely accurate is when you look at the actual globe itself. These ones, these are the only proper accurate of the sizes of the countries. Here they've tried to make it accurate as well by they've actually literally opened it up like an orange. That's the only way you can do that if you're going to put it on a flat surface to make it accurate to size. So you can see how much smaller Russia and Northern Europe look in these pictures. Yeah. This is how it should really be, the north at the bottom. But that looks very strange to us. But you can see Britain down there, and imagine the British Empire when Britain was ruling the world. It didn't want to be a little speck at the bottom down there, you know, it wanted to be a big thing at the top of the world, right? Okay, so renaming and reclaiming history. So we need a new generation of Muslim historians that are looking at a lot of these things very critically and looking at it from a Muslim bias. I don't mind if you're Muslim bias. It will counteract the massive the Western bias, you know. So Eurocentric and Islamocentric viewpoints. This is Roberts himself, the one who wrote that book, you know, the best-selling Penguin History of Europe. Oxford professor, you know, got that sort of look about him that, you know, this guy is a height of objectivity, right? Now, according to someone like Roberts, Western European civilization is the best thing that's ever happened to human beings, right? This is the most advanced technological civilization that is, people are just happier and generally more well off. Yes, there's a lot of inequalities. Yes, there's a lot of bad things that happen. But overall, what Western civilization has done is amazing. And we should give it a big pat on the back. And don't worry about millions of Native Americans being killed and things like that, because sadly, that was one of the sad consequences of this amazing European advancement. Liberal democracy is the ultimate in evolution of political systems. And this is ultimately the way that all human beings will be really, really happy. Previous civilizations may have had their good points. You know, the Muslims had some good things, the Romans had some bad things, good things, but ultimately all of them are backward and medieval compared to modern Western civilization. So that's his point of view, and the point of view that you will come across in many academic situations. Now, me, I have my own biases, you could call them, although I don't believe they're biases, I believe it's just reality. And I believe Islamic civilization was the best thing that happened to human beings. And I mean that very seriously. I'm not just saying that as a sort of thing. The Islamic civilization that endured for over 1,000 years before European civilization took over world domination was the best thing. And the people that lived under that civilization were the most happiest, freest, and generally well-off people that have lived historically. And because that society, that civilization was basically governed by the Quran. Throughout that 1,000 years of Muslim history, even though, you know, those Khalifas and those rulers may not have lived up to the ideals of the Quran on a personal basis, I'm not trying to say they were all angels or perfect people. Many of them were far from that. You know, there were tyrants, there were oppressive rulers and so on. But there was something that they all had in common. And that is that the Quran was recognized as the ultimate source of authority within that civilization. And within all of those societies, whether they were Abbasids or Umayyads or Ottomans or Safavids or Mughals, whatever they were, no sultan, no khalif, no ruler could ever dare to challenge the Quran. That was just ultimately given as a given. You know, that the Quran is the book that go, even if they didn't live up to that, and many times they didn't. But ultimately, the society was built on the rule of the Quran. There was a Qadi system in every Muslim civilization that came. There was a Qadi system. And the Qadis were scholars that were trained in Islamic law that was based on Quran and the Sunnah. So that was a fundamental aspect of that entire Muslim history. And in my opinion, that led to overall, not a perfect society. We don't believe in utopias and perfect societies. That just doesn't happen historically, ever. You know, the society is only as good as the people that make up the society. And the further that the people went from the Medinan period, which was the best period, you know, the Prophet ﷺ told us very clearly, my generation is the best of all generations. And the one after them is the second best, and the one after them is the best after that, and so on it goes. So the society is only as good as the people that make up the society. Right? So you can bring in the Quran right now and bring in the Qadi system and bring in Islamic law, but it doesn't mean you will have a perfect society, because we're not perfect. We're not the perfect people to fulfill that society. Right? So we can see that very clearly throughout Muslim history. When you start with the generation of the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ, and the way they were, and as time went on, the Quran, the Islamic law was still there, but people were not living up to those ideals. But at the same time, I feel that those people were more free, more happy, and generally more satisfied and equal than ever before. So that's for you guys to research for yourselves and find out for yourselves if what I'm saying is true or not. Yeah. Europe at that time was Christian, but later became secular. They lost their faith in God and in the Bible by and large, which we'll go into later. And we will argue as well later on how Christian was Western Europe anyway. We will see that often the rulers in themselves, the kings and the princes in Europe, Western Europe, even though they were nominally Roman Catholic, often they would turn against the Pope when it came down to power politics. But you could say that generally the general people, population were very religious in terms of being Catholics and so on. Now, the Middle Ages are actually the time when Islamic civilization was the dominant world civilization. And it's after the Middle Ages when European civilization eclipses the Islamic civilization. So the Middle Ages, what does it conjure up in your mind when we say Middle Ages? It's like a dark period, right? Because this is what Western historians have told us. The Middle Ages, medieval, the word medieval indicates something backward, and something like superstitious and dark and you know, barbaric. Barbaric is a good word for that, right? So this is the sort of the idea of the Middle Ages that we have in our minds, because we're heavily influenced by the Western historians and Western history telling. However, the Middle Ages was a time of the height of Islamic civilization around the world. Now, it is only towards the end of the Middle Ages, that Europeans started to then rediscover the art and the culture of ancient Greece and Rome through the writings of the Muslims, right? And that was called the Renaissance. So these European thinkers started talking about the Middle Ages and even the Dark Ages. The early Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages, when Europe was in darkness. There was no learning, there was no culture, there was no advancement. So these were called the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages were actually the golden age of Islam. You see the problem here? What people have in their mind about Middle Ages and Dark Ages and so on. Yeah, so I'm gonna... However, what we're going to argue is, in fact, the Middle Ages were a golden age for human beings, because these were the ages when the Islamic civilization was a dominant civilization around the world. And a term that I want to introduce is the Islamic millennium. Because for 1,000 years, the Islamic civilization was dominant in the world for over 1,000 years. And I think this is a great term, because naming is very, very important. What you name things is very powerful. You know, these names are literally like a summary. You know, when you say Dark Ages, that's like a summary of a massive concept in your mind. You know, it's got a lot of things behind it. So we need to start naming our own history. We can't let the West name us our history, because they don't do justice to it, and they fragment it. And they say, oh, the Arab conquests, or the Mughals, or the Mongols, or the Turks, right? They don't say Islamic history. They don't say Islamic civilization. They don't want us to realize that this was one continuous civilization. You know, they want it to be fragmented. So it's very important for us to then bring in this idea of the Islamic millennium. We start with the Umayyads, then the Abbasids, and then we have a fragmentation of many different Muslim sultans and emirs and so on. And then we have the three big Muslim empires, the Safavid, Mughal, and Ottomans. So this whole thing spans over 1,000 years. And the thing it has in common is that it is based on the rule of the Quran. As I said, it's an Islamic civilization. They're all Islamic empires. So Islamic millennium is a very powerful naming. If we can give it that name, it's very powerful, because immediately you know this is a millennium, this is 1,000 years when Islamic civilization is dominant. And I think we should do that, you know, we should bring in these type of terminology. Also, the Middle Ages start from, conventionally, in many historians, they consider the Middle Ages start from the fall of Western Rome. We'll discuss later how this is also a massive distortion, because they call it the fall of the Roman Empire, but it wasn't the fall of the Roman Empire, it was only the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire survived very, very long time until the Ottomans finally defeated it. But according to the Western history textbooks, the fall of Rome is 476. And this is when the Middle Ages start in conventionally. There's a lot of discussion amongst historians about when do the Middle Ages start and so on. Like everything has a lot of discussion and debate. But one of the conventional view is that we can say around about 476, when Western Rome is finally falls in Western Europe. However, I argue that the Middle Ages should actually start from 570 or 622, which is when the Prophet ﷺ is born in 570. And 622 is the start of the Hijri calendar. The Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ takes place in 622, which is year 1 of the Hijrah. And this would be a very neat place to start the Middle Ages, in which case I like the term Middle Ages, because the Quran describes the Muslims as a middle ummah. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We have made you a middle ummah. Wasat is literally the thing in the middle. So I don't mind the term Middle Age if we refer to that as the Islamic Age. Sorry, it's covered there by the thing. But then we have to then redefine the idea of Middle Age in our mind as not a backward and dark period, but an actual golden period in which the Islamic millennium takes place. I was really happy to find, after I started teaching this course, I did find one Western historian actually made this same point. And he said, and I wish I could remember who it was now, and I should have kept the reference. I think I've got it somewhere. But this particular Western historian actually said that we should think about redefining the beginning of the Middle Ages as the Hijrah, or the time of the birth of Islam, which I thought was pretty good. So Western historians are, you know, the Muslim contribution to history is becoming much more coming out in recent years, especially with all the new studies in Islam and everything. So people are beginning to recognize this fact that the massive Muslim history that has been sort of very much covered up by Western historians. Let's see if I can move this out of the way or something. Oops, sorry.
There's a cross on the annotation. Yeah,
But will I still be able to annotate now?
if you click it again, then.
Am I still on slides there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what this thing is. Oh, okay, that's it. Yeah. So the Islamic age altogether, the Islamic millennium starts, let's say, from the Hijrah 622 and all the way up to 1707. I've just put that an arbitrary date of 1707 as a symbolic end to the Islamic age, because in that year we have two major events. One is the death of Aurengzeb, who is the last of the great Mughal emperors. And after him, the Mughal Empire goes into rapid decline. And in 1707, we also have the unification of Great Britain. England and Scotland unify to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And it's this power, the Great Britain, is the power that will eventually sort of eclipse the Muslim powers, or the Muslim empires. So that's why I've put 1707 as a sort of symbolic date for the end of the Islamic age. Of course, there's no date, there's no year. It's just there's a gradual process of when Islamic civilization is declining and the European civilization is ascending, and that's basically during the 1700s. So by the time we get to 1800, the change has happened, the change is complete. So you could look at that century, the 1700s, the 18th century, as being the century of the transition from Islamic civilization to European or Western civilization. So you can see from 622 to 1707, this is roughly corresponds to what is known as the Middle Ages, right? The Islamic age roughly corresponds to what is known as the Middle Ages. Yep. And this is followed, the Islamic age is followed by then the European age, which starts in 1707 and continues to the present day. Now, when we say European age, this term I've taken from Roberts himself, that guy. People refer to it as a European age. It includes North America, United States of America, Australia, because all of those are actually European. They're part of European civilization. So it's probably better to call it Western age, or Western to include those, but European age is fine because it shows that they originated from Europe, those particular countries. So as we said, the Islamic civilization dominated the world for over 1,000 years. This was the fulfillment of Allah's promise to Prophet Isa alayhi salam and his followers, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give victory to the believers. Prophet Isa alayhi salam was not given victory in this world, right? And the people who followed him, they were not given victory in this world, but they were given a promise that soon the victory of Allah will come. This is very clear from the Quran and the Bible, right? Because the Quran tells us that the Prophet Isa, in Surah As-Saf, that one of the things that Prophet Isa alayhi salam was telling his followers is that I give you glad tidings of Ahmad, who will come after me, Ahmad. Yeah, the name was given to Prophet Isa alayhi salam. Now, one of the amazing things I found is a book that I'm going to refer to here, which is a book by Bart Ehrman. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, Bart Ehrman, right? Bart Ehrman is a historian of early Christianity, right? And he's got this book, The New Testament. Now, what Bart Ehrman basically says is that if you look at early Christianity, very, very early Christianity, and he obviously in the book, he goes into a lot of detail about the evidences behind what he's saying, which we haven't got time to, but in a later class, we'll come back to this as well. But it's one of the most amazing things for me, because I think it makes our Iman so strong, because the Islam and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is not something new. He is the last of a long chain of messengers. He's the last of a long chain of messengers. And what Bart Ehrman says is, if you study carefully and objectively the early Christian teachings and the Bible itself, and he puts out his whole methodology of how he studies, he says, there are certain things that we can know for sure about early Christianity. And there's certain things that we can be more speculative, and there's certain things that we can't be sure about. Yeah. The things that we can be really sure about, and there's only 2 or 3 things he mentions. He says one of them is that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. Apocalyptic. And what does he mean by that? Apocalyptic means that his followers, the very early Christians, were waiting for the apocalypse. They were waiting for the kingdom of God to come on this earth. They were like imminently waiting. They felt that this is going to come at any time. Yeah. What's called the apocalypse. So this is a quote from his book. Throughout the earliest accounts of Jesus' words are found predictions of a kingdom of God that is about to appear, in which God will rule. It will be a religious rule, in other words. This will be an actual kingdom here on earth. This is not talking about heaven or afterlife. Jesus is telling his followers this is going to come on this earth. The victory from Allah, in other words. When it comes, the forces of evil will be overthrown along with everyone who has sided with them. He's talking about the Roman Empire of his time, because the Roman Empire was the oppressive empire of the time. Yeah. Judgment on all others will be brought by the Son of Man. So he refers to this person, the Son of Man, a cosmic figure who is to arrive from heaven at any moment. So the key thing here is also, Bart Ehrman says that himself, it's very clear from the evidence that the strongest evidence is that Jesus was not talking about himself, his second coming here. When he talks about the Son of Man, he's talking about someone else, not himself. Because we believe that Jesus will come back as Muslims, and Christians also believe that. But here he was talking about someone else who will come. And interesting thing is, being a member of the Bani Israel will not be enough to escape that judgment. In other words, this person that will come, it will not be just for the Jews. Just being a Jew will not be enough to escape from this judgment. It will be for humanity. This is, for me, so amazing, you know. He goes on to say, this is words of Jesus that we can be sure of. Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of that one will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father and the holy angels. And this is what Bart Ehrman says now. There is no indication that Jesus, is talking about himself. On the contrary, Jesus appears to be talking about someone else. So it's amazing that the Quran told us this, that this is the thing that Jesus told his followers, that Ahmad is going to come, right? So then we see this quote from the Bible. And this is the one from the Quran, yeah? That I am coming to bring good tidings of a messenger to come after me whose name is Ahmad. So he was given the name, you see, he was given the name. And the point is here that in the Bible, we have this term paraclete in the Bible, paraclete. Yeah, I've got the quote there for you to check up. If you love me, keep my commands, and I will ask the Father, and he will give to you another advocate. The translation of the term paraclete, the paraclete is a Greek, which is a translation from the original language of the Bible, which is Hebrew, isn't it? Yeah. So paraclete is actually a Greek translation of the original. So paraclete in the Greek is translated into English as advocate. What is an advocate? Is a shafi, is someone who is an intercedes for you. And we know that this is one of the main names of the Prophet ﷺ, that he intercedes for people. Yeah. Also, this is another verse from the Bible where it's mentioned the paraclete, yeah, the advocate. Now, according to some of the nowadays, Christians say the paraclete is the Holy Spirit. Yeah, it has a meaning, as I said, of interceding, which is actually one of the main attributes of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in our tradition, that he's the one who intercedes. But also, some have argued that it's parakletos, which means the praiseworthy, which is actually the exact meaning of Ahmad. Yeah? Parakletos means the famed, illustrious, or praiseworthy. This is the exact meaning of Ahmad, the one who is praiseworthy. So some have argued that this was, mistranslated as parakletos, when it should be parakletos. Many of our classical scholars, Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, Al-Qurtubi, and some of our more recent, like Martin Nings, also have mentioned this, that the paraclete was referring to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the Bible. So this is amazing, that this is, according to Bart Ehrman, this is one of the only few things that we can be really sure about historically, that Jesus taught his people. One of the very, very few things that we can be 100% sure in the evidence that they were an apocalyptic community. They were imminently waiting for this person to come to bring the kingdom of God and the victory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, there was this belief of millennialism. Remember I talked about the Islamic millennium. So these early Christian sects, and they still exist today, in fact, there's some still exist, but early Christian sects, many believed that this awaited kingdom of God would last for 1,000 years. It would literally last for 1,000 years. And after that 1,000 years, the tribulations of Gog and Magog would come, and then before the end of the world.
So do you know what the Hebrew for paracletus is?
I don't, I'm afraid. I don't know the Hebrew for paracletus. But that's a really good question. I hope some people can look into that. And I don't know, I don't know if the original Bible actually was, the New Testament was Hebrew or Aramaic. That's the other thing, because the language that Jesus spoke was Aramaic. But obviously the formal language of the Jews was Hebrew. So that's another question I've never really looked into. But yeah, good question. Now, so that was a belief amongst the millennialists, the Christian sects. We know that the Jews in Medina, Yathrib, were waiting for the last prophet. They knew the last prophet is going to come. Why were the Jewish tribes in Yathrib, in the middle of Arabia? What were they doing there? There was three major tribes of the Jews, wasn't there? Bani Qaynuqa, I don't know if anyone can remember their names. and Bani Nadir, Bani Kainuka, and so on. Yeah, there were 3 tribes in Medina itself. And they were there because they knew that the final prophet is going to come in this town. They literally knew the location that it will come. That's why they were there, they were waiting. And they used to say to the Arabs, don't worry, soon the prophet is going to come, and we're going to get victory over all of you. We will get victory over all of you. The Quran says, يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. They know him as well as they know their own sons. This is how much knowledge that the Jews had about the final prophet in their scriptures, and they hid a lot of it. They hid a lot of it because what they didn't realize that it will come from the Arabs, because they'd forgotten that Ibrahim alayhi salam had another son, Ismail. Yeah, and the Arabs were descended from Ismail. They thought and they assumed that he would come from Bani Israel, from the other line of Ibrahim alayhi salam through Ishaq and Yaqub. They were just 100% sure that he's going to be one of the Jews. So when he came from the Arabs, they didn't want to accept him because of their arrogance. The Jews are a very, very arrogant people. That's just one of their sort of characteristics. Yeah. Now, some of them obviously did accept him, but the majority of them rejected him because they really got this thing about their lineage and their, you know, we come from this 1,000-year-old lineage back to Moses and all this stuff. They're very proud of their genetic lineage and things like that. So when he came from the Arabs, their arrogance prevented them from accepting him, even though they knew that this was the last prophet. They had all the descriptions in their scriptures. يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they know him as well as they know their own sons. And one of the Jewish scholars that did become Muslim, he said, in fact, we knew him better than we know our own son, because with our own son, we could have a doubt. Maybe my wife was unfaithful. Yeah, but with him, we had no doubt. The description was so clear of him that we had in our scriptures. So arrogance is the veil to truth. Arrogance is always the veil. Remember Iblis, alayhi la'na, I almost said alayhi salam. I need to slow down a little bit. Iblis alayhi la'na, may curse Allah be on him. He knew that Allah is true, and he knew that he should bow to Adam, but what stopped him? Arrogance, right? Aba wastakbara. He refused and he had arrogance. So arrogance is always the thing that will stop someone from accepting the truth, even though they know it's true. So the Jews, they knew this is the prophet. They knew it, but they just wouldn't accept. He was not one of the Jews, right? So the arrogance prevented them. I'm going to skip some of these because we're coming up to the end of our time, inshallah. Now, the point I'm making here is, for me personally, it's been one of the things that really strengthened my iman. You know, when you realize that the Prophet ﷺ is someone who was expected, you know, and is there in the books. It's still there in the books. The Jews were there in Yathrib waiting for him. And the Quran tells us that this last messenger, Muhammad ﷺ, was a unique, he was awaited since the earliest times. You know, this, I won't go through this ayah of Quran, but I think the English is in the next one. Yeah. Allah made a covenant with the previous prophets and said to them, when he comes, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes, you make a covenant that you will help him and you will believe in him. This is to the previous prophets, Yeah, you should believe in him and you should help him. They answered, we agree. These were the previous prophets that were told about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in other words, was something that was awaited by humanity since the earliest times. And this is why I argue, you know, because one of the things that I personally don't like, and which is a trend, amongst our Muslim scholars is that they reduce Muslim history to 30 years of the Khulafa Rashidun. Yeah, according to many Muslim scholars today, they want you to just focus on the Khulafa Rashidun, which is 30 years, the rightly guided Khalifas after the Prophet ﷺ, because after that, the Muslim rulers, they all became corrupt, they became into dunya, they got into drinking alcohol and this and that and the other. So we shouldn't really talk about them. In fact, we're a bit embarrassed about them and we're ashamed of them. And everything went bodged. I think that's such a shame. You know, you now just erased, as Muslim scholars, you're now erasing 1,000 years of Muslim history. Because Harun Rashid used to drink alcohol sometimes or drink wine now and then. You don't want to talk about that to Muslims because they might quickly run to the pub and start drinking Jack Daniels or something like that. No, I don't think that's right. You know, yes, they weren't perfect, many of those. But like, you know, Sheikh Hamza once said a long time ago, he said, I'd give an arm and a leg to have one of those Khalifas now, you know. So this is what I'm trying to argue, that look, we need to rediscover that Islamic millennium. Yes, it wasn't perfect, but we never believed in a utopia. That's a Marxist idea. You know, we've never said human societies can be perfect, full stop anyway. No one's ever claimed that from the Muslims, right? But it was the best that it can be. That's all I'm going to say. And there was a general justice and a general type of peace for most of the time, for most of the people during the Islamic millennium. Okay, so now, how do non-Muslims portray this Islamic this Islamic age? I don't want to say golden age because golden age is something that non-Muslims have put a label on our history. And that golden age is about 200 years of the Abbasid, the height of the Abbasid. And they call that the Islamic golden age, you know? But I think there was a golden age that lasted 1,000 years. So non-Muslims will, as I said before, they will fragment our history, yeah? Turks, Arabs, Saracens, Persians, Mughals, Tartars, right? No one makes that connection. Wait a minute, this is all one Muslim civilization. The golden age is, they had that golden age back then, you know, 200 years or so for during the 1,001 nights and all that stuff, yeah? If you read a standard world history textbook that they teach in schools to today, Islamic history will be like 2 or 3 pages, right? I mean, we can give examples, we're not going to that. Now, recently things are beginning to change. There's much more awareness. Sad to say, but since 9/11, the study of Islam and Islamic history has become massive in Western universities, all because of the Muslim terrorist thing and everything. But there are some positive aspects to that. And that is because in academia, it's you know, people are given a lot of freedom. So there is a lot of now awareness coming about in the last definitely 5, 10, 15 years. And people are also starting to identify this type of concept of Islamic civilization being one civilization that spanned over 1,000 years. So recent books, for example, Andrew Marr has written a book on world history, not a historian, obviously, he's a journalist, but they sort of more acknowledging this fact, but this still has not filtered down to school and college textbook level. This book I like because look at the title. This is quite a recent book on Islamic history, published by a non-Muslim publishing house, but it's called Islam, 1,000 Years of Faith and Culture. And that's what I like. They've acknowledged the 1,000 years aspect of Islamic civilization. But this is a very new thing. And hopefully this will become more, you know, people will accept this more and more. But the fact that they've actually acknowledged that this is a history of a civilization that spans 1,000 years is a big shift actually in Western academia. Now, a little while ago, I said, look, under the Islamic age, the vast majority of people lived peaceful, happy, contented lives for the vast majority of time. Now, you might find that odd thing to say, because normally when you read history books, and I'm talking now about history books written by Muslims as well, all you will read is it will be one battle after another, one conquest after another, one dynasty overthrowing another. That's generally what history books focus on. And that's natural to some extent. Yeah? But when you read that, you just get the idea of complete all the time military conquest, fighting, fighting, fighting. But you lose track of what was the life like for the normal people during that time. You know, for the vast majority of the time, the normal people, the normal Muslims and other non-Muslims that lived under Muslim lands, they were not even affected by all of those wars and battles and one dynasty fighting against another dynasty. These battles were very, very limited in scope and in number of people fighting as well. And literally the average normal people living in the say the cities like Damascus, Homs, and these great cities in the Muslim world, they would say one ruler has been changed by another ruler. We pay our taxes to someone else now. Now we pay our taxes to someone else. It made no difference to their daily life. So this is really important. And the reason why I'm saying this is because let's look at how, for example, Western historians talk about ancient Rome or Greece. Now, these were highly oppressive, tyrannical type of empires. But when you read it in Western, they have this sort of positive things to say about them. So once again, the Penguin History of Europe, when he talks about the ancient Romans, for example, yes, he does mention all the bad things they did. They went around killing and invading loads of people. But then he puts in these sort of positive snippets like this, look, to provide regular lawful government to black, white, brown, Romans equally. See, he's saying they're not, they were equal towards everyone. And to assure to them also peace and prosperity. All this was without precedent and remains the best grounds for saying that the Romans did great things. You see the sort of positive glowing, because they identify this is our, these are our ancient, this is our heritage. So why we Muslims can't be a little bit, looking a bit positively towards our civilization? If you can say that about the Romans, why can't we say, look at the Muslim civilizations in that way? You see what I mean? So I'm just conscious of the time. I think I'm going to wrap up, inshallah. And we're playing a little bit of catch up, but I think we have caught up quite a lot. We haven't quite completed the last slides for today, but I think we've done quite well, inshallah. And by next week, inshallah, we should be able to catch up where we need to get to. So just to finish once again on this idea of, if you read a book like Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. Now, Bertrand Russell, this is one of the most popular books on, general books on history of Western philosophy. Bertrand Russell is one of the most famous 20th century philosophers in the West. This book basically describes the whole of philosophy as once again an evolution throughout history. So human thought has evolved slowly, slowly over many centuries until you get to modern Western man and modern Western philosophy, which is like the evolution of many, few thousand years at least of evolution of thought. So once again, the idea of evolution and progress, and that we've progressed all this time. I remember I asked Dr. Omar Abdullah, I said I only had one class with him many years ago, in which he went through that paper. After that class, I asked him this question. I said, look, what you're describing about the ancient people and doesn't really tally up with what you read in things like Bertrand Russell, that things have evolved, And he said, well, look, we don't know what they were thinking. We don't know what they were thinking. Ancient Egyptians or people before them how can we say that Western philosophy has become so advanced after all these centuries? Maybe people thousands of years ago were thinking more advanced stuff. We just simply don't know. Okay, inshallah. So I think I've talked about the Ibn Battuta thing anyway, so we can skip that slide, inshallah. Okay, let's leave it there. Jazakumullah khairan for your patience and attendance. I'll open up for any last questions, but if anyone desperately wants to leave, they can also go as well.
Simon just said, do you recommend that book that you showed?
The 1,000 Years of Faith, yeah, Islam. Do I recommend that book? I can't recommend it because I haven't actually read it myself. I just like the title. I have got it, but I never actually got around to reading it. It's quite sort of introductory level, so I didn't feel it would be useful for me personally to read at that time. But if someone wants an introductory to Islamic history like us, it might be good. I think it looks good, but I haven't read it, so I don't want to recommend something I haven't read. So I'll just hold back on that.
Is the lesson 2 quiz on the website somewhere?
Lesson 2 quiz is now not on the website yet, but inshallah by tomorrow or soon it will be on the website. And yeah, any other questions? Any other sisters? Anyone online have a question? Sorry, yeah.
You mentioned 3 sources of knowledge and history is one of them. What are the other 2?
I was really wishing no one would ask me that question because I couldn't. The reason why I didn't mention it, I couldn't quite remember the other. I think the other 2 are, one is nature, because the Quran talks a lot about looking at things around us, the sun, the moon, the trees. So in other words, nature, study of nature, which is basically biology and science, is the second one. And the third one is where the Quran says, look, consider within yourselves. So human psychology. I think, Allah Alim, I will double check from Muhammad Iqbal's book and verify, but I think those were the 3. But history was definitely one of them. Any other from the people online?